Shalom, and welcome to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. This is a recording of a Shabbat sermon with Rabbi Shapiro, Building Community Together.
There's a custom in our tradition that after someone passes away, there is a learning done in their honor, in their memory. And good friend of mine, Chaim Taref, Rabbi T, a Rav Beit Sefer here at Pressman Academy, his father passed away about a year ago. And he reached out to friends and colleagues, as is sometimes the case, for people to take on different tractates of the Mishnah, to learn the whole Mishnah in memory of his father, which is a beautiful way to remember someone who we have lost. And Matt, in March of 2024, thought it would be a great idea and no problem to take on Tractate Eruvin, 10 chapters of some of the most complex and esoteric rabbinic layers of text that you can take on. February 2025, Matt was less fond of that decision. I made it, don't worry. And believe it or not, in Eruvin, there's some really interesting stuff as well that you can learn along the way. And one piece that I hadn't really considered before, when I think about an Eruv, I think about, folks know about this, that it's an enclosure that we create on Shabbat because we are told that we shouldn't carry on Shabbat, and the Torah says we shouldn't carry on Shabbat. And so in order to make sure that we can carry on Shabbat, there's the rabbinic fiction of creating an Eruv such that there is a larger boundary within which we can carry the things that we need on Shabbat. And the way that I have historically thought of that is primarily just the boundary itself. The enclosure in Los Angeles, it's a very, very large space encompassed by freeways, right? There's plenty of space for us to schlep stuff around on Shabbat. But there's, of course, more to it than that. There's an element as well that in order for the Eruv to be effective, there has to be food. There has to be some amount of food that's made that is considered to be communally shared. In the Mishnah, they talk about this a lot, in order essentially for the Eruv to be activated. It's not enough to create the boundary itself. You have to have the food there, communally shared food, that sort of flips the Eruv switch on so that people can carry within that boundary. And that's an interesting idea. That's not something that I had really known about before in any depth. And extrapolating out a little bit of what that symbolizes and what that might mean, it's something concrete, it's something visible, it takes forethought and practical work in a really specific way. It's not just enough that you've crafted the boundary and you've left it up for a while. Each and every Shabbat, you have to take time, set it aside, so that the Eruv is effective. And in my mind, that's something that we can learn a lot about in terms of what it is to create holy space and holy time together. It's not something that just happens. It's something that we have to take proactive action in and make sure that it's something that we share together. There's a resonance for me here as well with our Parsha. We wrapped up Pekudei this morning, the end of the book of Exodus, and we've been reading for a while now about how to create the Mishkan, about how the ancient Israelites built the tabernacle, the space within which God would dwell. This was an extensive endeavor, to say the very least. It took labor, it took materials, it took craftsmanship, it took a lot of work. And this, of course, wasn't just an ancient Near Eastern art project. This was the very space in which God would dwell. By crafting this space, by bringing their offerings forward, the Israelites made it possible for God's very presence to dwell within the camp. Now, creating an Eruv for Shabbat and creating the Mishkan back when we were wandering the desert, those are, of course, different things, and I see within them a number of thematic similarities. Through both of those projects, a group of people takes concrete action to set aside holy space and time through which community is built. And it's interesting to note that that has shifted over time, of course. First, when we were wandering, it was the Mishkan. Then, when we were considering rabbinic law, we think about it through the lens of Eruv, and it's worth considering the ways in which it is both similar and different. And thinking back through the different layers of our tradition, what are the similarities between how we built holy space and time then, and what might we consider about what it looks like to continue to craft and shape and proactively take on the challenge of creating holy space and time now. And of course, it's not just worth considering what we do, but also how we do it. As we're wrapping up at the end of chapter 39 in Shemot, hearing about how the work was done, there's a verse that seems to be pretty straightforward, that reads, Kechol asher tziva Adonai et Moshe, Ken asu bnei Yisrael et kol ha'avodah, that just as Adonai had commanded Moses, so the Israelites had done all the work. Pretty straightforward. God told Moses something, he told it to the Israelites, they did the work. But Rabbeinu Bachya notices something interesting about the word choice in that verse. You would think in that verse, with the noun referring to the work that's done, that the noun would be melacha. Melacha, which is a category of work often used to refer to the types of work that were prohibited from doing on Shabbat, which conversely are often the categories of work that are referred to as what we did to build the Mishkan. But instead, the noun rather used in this verse is avodah. Ken asu b'nei Yisrael et kol ha'avodah. They did all of this avodah, and Rabbeinu Bachya notices that and says that this is work they did as a service to God. It wasn't just that they took that action of cutting the fabric and nailing the planks together. It was more than that. They took those straightforward tasks and they elevated them into something more. And through that, that holy space and that holy time was created. So then we can ask that for ourselves around how we can do the same thing that the Israelites did, taking that everyday work and elevating it into something more. And I would suggest that we do that by making sure there is a value, that there are values at the center of everything we choose to do. That here, the value of crafting holiness was what pushed their work forward. And going back to my new favorite rabbinic topic of Eruvs, there's an interesting text, there's a really interesting phrase that shows up towards the end of chapter 7 in Mishnah 9. And I'll try to do this without getting too deeply in the weeds, but of course we should always return to rabbinic texts as much as we can. So whoever wants to learn Mishnah Eruvin, you can find me after services. I'm your guy. But there's a question of what it's necessary to merge different spaces into one domain. If there's alleys, if there's courtyards, if there's different enclosures, how much and what do you need to do to make it so that it's one space in which you can carry what you want to schlep around on Shabbos? And there's a conversation around how much you have to do within different sized spaces. There's a category of space called a mavoy, sort of an alleyway, not a major thoroughfare, but an alleyway. And it also seems, according to the rabbis, that the food through which you indicate that the Eruv is active, there also needs to be food set aside in a chatzer, in a courtyard, encompassed within the alleyway, which is significantly smaller. So why would that be the case? You've already done the work to show that the bigger space is sort of kosher for carrying in, as it were. So why do you need to go out of your way to also have food set aside in the courtyard? It seems to be redundant. It seems to be unnecessary. And here's this really interesting phrase that pops up. It actually doesn't have anything to do with making sure that you can carry in the space. The phrase used in the Mishnah is kedei shelo l'shacheach et hatinokot, so that kids should know about it, so that kids shouldn't forget about this category of Eruv. So to a certain extent, yes, it's practical in terms of making sure that in generations to come, that future generations will know about this holy obligation. And it's more than that too. That it's thinking about education, that we're thinking about legacy. It's not just the practical elements of how do you make sure that the Eruv is working. It's about layering in this value of making sure our kids know about what it is to create holy time and space that pushes forward a different type of action than we might otherwise think that we would make a point to do, which in turn can push us to ask a similar question, that as we think about creating holy time and space, what are the values that anchor us in that, and how do we take those abstract values and bring them into something concrete that helps make sure that those values are right there, right for the plucking. And I would say that this in and of itself is a model for thinking about how to build community. When we do the hard work of coming to some consensus about what really matters to us, it's not just thinking about, therefore, what we'll do with that, but that work in and of itself on sort of a meta level helps guide us in thinking about what we might do to build community together. It helps focus our efforts. It gives us a place to channel our energy. We know what we're trying to do when it's about more than just a task, that we can pause and reflect on, are these values that are essential to us really unfolding within the ways in which we're building community? It's not easy. The tasks themselves are not easy. Building the Mishkan took a while. Sustaining Eruvs takes effort. Building holy community takes a lot of work. And determining the values that anchor the community, that anchor that holy time and space, though it's not necessarily done with our hands, it is also not something that just happens overnight. But it's heartening to me that we have different models for how we've done this over time, that it's something that we as a people have done for centuries and centuries. And we're blessed to have models that can guide us, some models that still work. There's still an LA Eruv. We still have that. And it's also, of course, worth thinking about, are there other models that we can and should and will try for how to sustain our holy time and space together? There's something poetic about closing the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus, with this process of building the Mishkan. There are some big wow moments in Exodus. We leave Egypt. We receive the Torah. And what's the whole back half of the book about? Building the Mishkan. That's what we focus on. So it's not always about the big wow of what's happening, but it's about that painstaking work of building community together. We do achieve our goal at the end of the Parsha. The presence of God does indeed come and dwell within the tabernacle, and we hear about it for a few verses. Just for a moment, after chapters and chapters of work, we get to the destination, we achieve that moment, and then we move forward from there. The peak spiritual experiences that we might shoot for and want and crave in our lives are possible, and they don't happen every day. But when we know that the work is for something bigger than us, that is something that can ensure that we take that work and it helps us to elevate it from melacha to avodah. And I'll encourage you each to think about how we might do that as we conclude this book today of Shemot. And as we said earlier in this room, chazak, chazak, v'nit chazek, that may we find strength and may we strengthen each other always as we take on the holy obligation and opportunity to continue to craft holy time and holy space together.
You've been listening to another in our series of podcasts from Temple Beth Am, a dynamic center for conservative Judaism in Los Angeles. If you enjoy these podcasts, we invite you to write a review on the Apple Podcast website or wherever you get your podcasts. For more information on Temple Beth Am, Los Angeles, go to www.tbala.org.